What makes a good shoe a good one and what makes a bad shoe? I'll speak to you a little bit about the details and how you go into a shop and can hopefully pick out these things. The first thing is leather, and there's a lot to be spoken about how to tell good leather from bad. If you look into aniline box calf leather, you can see a certain depth or transparency in the leather. The shoe is a three-dimensional product and it plays light very differently. But if something is pigmented completely, light plays doesn't happen. You can see it almost looks cheap. Whereas with aniline leather, it's almost transparent, it's translucent, the leather. It plays light very differently, so you can almost tell how rich the leather looks. Another thing to look out for is how fine the grain is. Typically the grain will not be consistent throughout. On some parts it would be a lot finer and some parts it will be fine, but we don't want to see a very bold grain. Now I'm talking about classic box calf leathers. Of course this changes if you're looking at milled leathers or suede leathers, but to keep the conversation more simple, we're talking about simple box calf leathers. So that's as far as upper is concerned. Let's get to the next ones. Check the inside of the shoe. See if it has a lining, not just on the back part, which is the part that's most visible, but also on the inside, which is where your toes touch the shoe. Sometimes this part could be made of textile, cost-cutting measures. So let's make sure that the lining is fully leather in this case. Third one is to see if the insole, which is where, well, this part, one in the front, is completely leather as well, and it's mostly vegetable tan leather because it's so deep inside. Now there's not many ways you can tell that if it is vegetable tanned or not, but what's important is that it's leather, and if it is, it absorbs sweat much better, it takes the shape of feet much better over time. By that extension makes the shoe much more comfortable. Then coming back to the upper part, we can look at the stitch pitch, which is how tight the stitches are, how many stitches you have per inch, if it's too broadly spaced or much finer on the upper. The same you could look at the outsole stitching. If this is a Goodyear welted pair, you can see the stitches on the outside. Certain Blake shoes, even though the stitch is done at the bottom, will have decorative stitch in the front. You can tell more or less what a decorative stitch looks like. When you look close to the stitch, it would look too even, artificial, but that's what it is. It's not a real stitch, it's just there for decorative purpose. But in a Goodyear welted shoe, you can tell the stitch pitch and you're looking for something fine. I would say in the region of 8-9 stitches suggest a really well made, well constructed Goodyear welted shoe. And then you see stitches at the edge here, but when you turn to the bottom, you don't see the stitches, and that's because a channel has been taken out on the outsole, a groove is made to which the stitches are then stitched, then it's closed out. A lot more difficult to do something like that. So that's another telltale sign of a good, well constructed shoe. Another thing I look out for is how the heel is constructed. If there are stacks, and I'm looking for about 3, 4, 5 stacks depending on how thick each layer of the leather is, and you can see the anilinity of the depth of the leather here as well. These are all vegetable tanned stacks. We don't want it to be too pigmented, to have a nice play of color. Even if it is black, we don't want pigmented black. We want a nice transparent, translucent kind of black. Plays light very well. It shows beauty over time. That's another area to look out for. The most important thing, and this is something you can't quite describe, when you look at a good pair of shoes, there's a sense of beauty about it that you can't quite explain. That comes from the shape of the shoe, and therefore by extension the last. If it's too bulky, it doesn't look beautiful. You can't tell why a good shoe and a bad shoe sometimes from far away. It's because the last is so beautifully made. It allows for the proportions of the feet to be shown onto the shoe itself. That's a more subtle point, but one that most people can more or less tell immediately. If someone's wearing a good pair of shoes, like, oh wow, that looks nice, and that comes from how well the shape of the shoe is maintained, and that comes from the last. As I said, if you last the shoe well, the shape continuously sort of kept over the years. When it comes to the bottom, I like to see a slight curve at the bottom of the shoe. In classic Goodyear welted shoes, this adds to the beauty. It's a little bit more difficult to construct a nice curvature here, so that adds also to the quality of a shoe. Another detail I like on Goodyear welted shoes is where the edge, what you call a 2B cutter or a double lip, where you see a slight lip on either side of the outsole. It just makes for the shoe to be a little bit more beautiful, a lot more difficult to make. Therefore it's another telltale sign of a good shoe, because you have to take that effort to ensure that the thickness of the outsole and of your trimmer is matched for every single pair. There can be a millimeter or two of difference, but even that is accounted for, and the trimmer knife is changed. So these are smaller things that, you know, a good factory or a good brand will ensure that these details are showcased in their shoes. That's my take on how you can tell a good shoe from some not so good one or a bad one. If you have any more points like that or something new, put it on the comments or write to me. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks.